Well, welcome everybody. We might get started. It's just past the hour. This is Shahram Akbarzadeh. I'm the convener of Middle East Studies Forum at Deakin University. It is a privilege and a delight to welcome you all and also welcome our speakers to talk to us about settler colonialism, slow violence in the Gaza Strip. Professor Michelle Pace is a professor of global studies at Roskilde University. Her research and teaching interests are in the area of political theory, psychology, philosophy, emotions and international relations, and migration and settler colonial studies. She has been the principal investigator on a Carlsberg Foundation project looking at the struggle of state building in Palestine, and is also the Danish lead partner on an EU Middle East network in action, Jean Monnet Network. Professor Michelle Pace is presenting here with her collaborator, Professor Haim Yacoubi, who is a professor of development planning at University College London. His research interests relate to urban space and social justice and the politics of identity, urban health, and colonial planning. He has a strong track record of advocating for human rights and planning in Israel, and has published on that topic, including a book titled Rethinking Israeli Space, Periphery, and Identity. Michelle and Haim will talk to us about the project that they are currently running, funded by Wellcome Foundation. So I won't say much about that. But following their presentation, we'll be joined by Dr. Marcello Swirsky from University of Wollongong, who also shares that research interest in colonial settlement. So welcome all. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Michelle and Haim to share their research with us.
Thank you very much. And on behalf of the research team for this project, I would like to thank the Middle East Studies Forum for inviting us and giving us this opportunity to discuss our research findings from this project. And to start with, I'd like to also thank the Wellcome Trust Small Grant, as well as the Bartlett Synergy Grant and my own department for financial support. And I will start briefly by introducing the team. So apart from Haim and myself, we have Dr. Ziad Abu Mustafa, who has helped us to actually conduct all the fieldwork that we required in Gaza. And we also had support from Dr. Manal Masalah, who helped us with all the reports that we needed from the WHO, the UN agencies, etc. So thank you to everybody. Now to start with, I will briefly say something about the focus of this research and its background. So there is quite a tendency when we talk about health to look at it in isolation. And what struck us was that with the embeddedness of settler colonialism in Palestine, it's important to see the connection between the violence inherent and systematic violence, but also the power that targets specifically bodies and individuals in the Gaza Strip. So it's a sustained triangulation from our part to focus on this connection between power, violence, and health. And in particular, to take it from a humanitarian approach in the sense of focusing on the everyday lives of Gazans and what this inherent violence actually means for them on an everyday basis. So there is also an inherent connection in our research on different forms of infrastructural violence. So by infrastructure, we do not just mean the physical buildings, for instance, hospitals or schools, but also the everyday needed infrastructures of water, especially pure water and drinking water, access to food, and the kind of basic health services that people on an everyday require. So we're also looking into this from a perspective of basic fundamental rights of any human, wherever you are. So there is a connection with space, and there's also a connection with the body, and there's a connection with the legality. or illegality of this violence. But to mention this, it's important for us to focus on the effect of this infrastructural violence, not only as impinging upon the everyday lives as to make the lives, lifeless. We'll come back to that, but it's important to mention from the beginning that we're also looking at forms of resilience and resistance from Gazans in spite of all this inherent violence. So our focus sustains very much this need to look at the agency of Gazans in this context. Thanks, Chaim. For the next one, please.
Yeah.
So moving on, I'll pass on to Chaim now.
Thank you, Michelle. So basically what we are going to do, we're going to present our main arguments. And the first one has to do with the logic of elimination. And as mentioned by Michelle, what we are trying to do is to look at the Gaza Strip within the settler colonial academic debate, and to highlight the ways in which settler colonial projects prioritize territorial and demographic control over basic rights. And what we find, and again, this is based on some of the interviews that Ziad conducted in Gaza, what we find is that in Gaza, the case of Gaza challenges our understanding of settler colonial projects. Because on the one hand, Israel withdrew from Gaza, and some people would argue, okay, so, no settlers, i.e. no settler colonialism. But what we would like to highlight is that Gaza is a specific typology of settler colonialism without settlers, i.e. the logic of settler colonialism, the logic of elimination is still very, very central to the ways in which Israel refers to Gaza. And what is very important, as it has been also expressed by a wonderful artist from Gaza, Dina Matar, the technology, the military technologies enables it. And I would like to quote from one of our interviews, "No life in Gaza at all, for the simple reason that we do not have security. Drones fill the sky constantly, and personally, I'm afraid to go to other places or outside of my neighborhood due to sudden bombing by Israeli air forces, which is a threat to our lives. Moreover, days are repetitive with nothing new." So I think, this citation encapsulates the ways in which Gazans experience the logic or the settler colonial logic as it is today. The other pillar of our argument has to do with the notion of everyday non-life. The notion of everyday life is very central to the urban literature, to the anthropological literature, but according to some of the findings and the interviews that were taken in Gaza, people describe their experience as non-life. And despite of the problematic notion of this expression, we feel that this is very, very central. So just to mention briefly what we can see, at least in Lefebvrean thinking, everyday life is really about the totality. It's about our social networks. It's about our mobility. It's about our relationships with others. And once violence is operating, what we can see is that everyday life is transferred into everyday non-life. So what we feel, and we rely very much on the wonderful book of James Rohn, Frontiers and Ghettos, that there is an urgent need to critically understand the transformation of everyday life in Gaza into everyday non-life. By everyday non-life, we mean the intentional frontierization of a given territory, the destruction of the totality of everyday life, of urban and rural experience, the not yet arrived, and it's a quotation from an interview, death, as a central part of the lived experience that dictates the daily lives of Gazans, resulting in the economy of life and death, which is in turn embedded in the Israeli regime of control. And I think, this quotation encapsulates this idea quite well. We are in Gaza, like the person who is sentenced to be executed, and he or she is in the executor's cage, and every half an hour or hour, they inform him or her, we are going to execute you after a while. This is a torture, not life at all. I prefer to be executed, but not to be in this no life situation. Michelle.
So in order to shed a little bit more light on the embeddedness of settler colonialism in the case of Palestine, we introduce a temporal dimension. And we do this through Nixon's notion of slow violence. So this is often not visible and it occurs gradually. And the idea is that you have delayed destruction, both in space but also in time. So it's actually attritional violence and often is not seen as violence at all. So for instance, the situation we have is that Israel is destroying the very basic amenities. So when we look at food, for instance, we have aerial herbicides being sprayed on Gazan crops. We have the crisis with water, we have the crisis with electricity. So this makes for what we call the liminal in Gaza non-life, because it's like being on a life machine and every now and then one of the pipes is removed from your life machine. So this brings us to a very important notion of unbearable life, that life becomes so unbearable. And we have seen from many interviewees that either the young revert to suicide and they actually record themselves on video for others to follow their life thinking, or else they emigrate. So they try to have some kind of life elsewhere. And I just quote here, immigration is the best solution to overcome the daily crisis in Gaza. And personally, I'm trying to save money in order to immigrate, as I don't think, there's any life here. Or the fierce occupation disrupted the beauty of Gaza. It's intervened in every detail of our life. And this is something that is also shown artistically by the famous Gazan artist Iyad Sabah, who had this beautiful piece called Worn Out. And it depicts a family of 8 and the sheer exhaustion. And yet in the background, there is the sea, there is life. So we come now to something very important that I'll talk a little bit more towards the end, but I'll move on now to give the floor to Haim. So just to perhaps conclude, one of the things that is important to mention is that although we have the sober analysis, one of the things that also emerged is this idea of alter life, that although the violence is inherently influencing the life of Gazans every day, there is still the sustaining and capacity in Gazans of trying to do something else. So this has been seen in the form of the Gaza March of Return, for instance, where people started off with a very non-violent, peaceful protest, trying to make the point that we're still here, we're still resisting, and we will return one day. So I just wanted to round us off with a more positive connotation, but of course it comes with some premises. So we look forward to Marcello's comments on our presentation. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marcello. The floor is yours if you'd like to share your feedback.
Yes, thank you, Shalom. First of all, thank you for inviting me to take part in this. I need to clarify that my comments are also based not only on these presentations, but have read the work that Michelle and Haim have written on this research. So I'm basing my comments on that. And when reading that paper, I was truly taken aback, moved by the statements of the interviewees in Gaza. The idea that people wonder about the worth of life is very distressing. And that was something that I found particularly strong in the ethnography. Now, I have three sort of comments on the overall research and work. One comment is on the research design. Another comment will be a bit more theoretical. And if we have time, I would like to push for a minor nuance as well. Now let's start from a first comment on the research design. I think that this project attempts to strike a balance, I would say, between two sort of problematizations that are intrinsic to settler colonial theory, particularly when the researchers are not indigenous people. Now, one such problematization is what can be called Patrick Wolf division of academic labor, according to which settler scholars must focus on researching their own societies and regimes. Now, Wolf's dichotomy is quite strict, and I must add also that, as a matter of fact, indigenous peoples, including Palestinians, as far as I know, their preference is for scholars who are settlers not to study indigenous societies. Having said that, on the other hand, the other problematization of research of settler colonialism is that some of us, as myself, settlers, are not just settlers. In other words, some of us invest in transcending our own subjectivities, and we do try to avoid that, you know, our positionality not to outdo whatever changes we try to make in our personalities, in our ways of being. So given that, when non-indigenous people, including scholars, find a way to collaborate with indigenous people and indigenous agendas, as in this case, I believe, to produce pro-indigenous political spaces, in that way, they are in fact establishing a critique of settler colonialism that obviously we need. So again, I think that this research project tries to find its identity between these two types of problems that are very characteristic to settler colonial theory. A second comment will be more theoretical. The research identifies the Gaza situation as a distinctive case of settler colonialism. And to conceptualize this, the authors use, as we just heard, the concept of slow violence and also the ghetto frontier comparative tactic. Now, I understand that the emphasis here is on frontier. We know that the production of frontiers is pivotal in settler colonial formation across the globe. Though when we think of frontier, we generally think of expansion through indigenous displacement. In other words, what we have at the basis of this displacement is movement. Movement is what animates the process of displacement and eventually replacement. But what is very interesting in this study is that the author basically imply that in the case of Gaza, immobility and not mobility is the locomotive of Israel's settler colonial dominance. So what I would try to think about is, rather than conceptually surfacing the frontier out of a comparison with the ghetto, I would suggest to produce a sort of internal differentiation to frontier itself. So in fact, basing a sort of comparison of frontier still within what can be called classical settler colonial theory. Now, this type of frontier, which Michel and Chaim stress is immovable, is nevertheless, and this is really interesting, is nevertheless always already a moving frontier in the waiting. Why? The violence unleashed towards Gaza from what the authors call the safe place outside the street where the Israeli soldiers manage the street is a terrifying place. It's ominous, not only in the sense of its current manifestations of violence, but mainly in its potentiality. And that potentiality we have seen that unleashed in the many Israel invasions into the street. So I think that it's really interesting that immobility is really terrifying here in this particular case. Now, I don't know, Shahram, if I have 2 more minutes to add a comment?
Sure, 2 more minutes.
Okay, thank you. So one more point on the settler colonial paradigm itself. Generally, people have made the effort to distinguish the settler colonial paradigm from classical colonialism, mainly by insisting that settler colonialism is not about exploitation, but about displacement, replacement of indigenous populations by people who come to stay. Now, lately, more and more scholars are insisting that we should add a component of exploitation to understand particularly the social reproduction of settler colonial societies, without which it's very difficult to understand how these regimes continue to reproduce themselves. Now, if we look into this particular case of Gaza, and we ask, is Israel producing any type of settler colonial usufruct in relation to Gaza? I believe that the answer is yes. For Israel, the siege on Gaza is one more front where it can, and it does, experiment not only with war technology, but also with Israeli subjectivities themselves. We know today, for instance, that the IDF psychological services have been preparing soldiers who were about to be dispatched to open fire on peaceful demonstrators during the March of Return. Now, this is totally about pushing the limits of what a soldier can do. And also, if you take into account the accompanying response of the Israeli society, which is no less terrifying, this is, I believe, about reworking the boundaries of Israelis' predispositions in the relation to the settler colonial project. So this immovable frontier that we were talking about a moment ago, it's in fact a sort of assemblage that is actively producing, investing in the reproduction of this project, of the settler colonial project. That is it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Marcello. Michelle and Chaim, would you like to respond to Marcello before we open the floor to questions?
Of course. Michelle, would you like to pick one of the points and then I will do the other one?
Yeah, I would just like to thank Marcello because those were really nice ways in which he drew upon, all the dimensions of our work, both the design, the research design, the conceptual work, but also its implications. And I just want to say that for me, it shows us that our work is it's so crucial that we keep on doing this because as we try to say in the project, there are new ways in which settler colonialism is trying to go even deeper, it's sedimenting itself. So I think the fact that Marcello touched upon what is happening with the psychology of IDF soldiers tells us something that in a way is very short-term sighted from the settler colonizer itself. So the damage being done to the Israeli society is not something that is, I think, included in this assemblage, because although the violence is so, so embedded on the everyday Gazan life, this is another project to look at, the deeply embedded violence inherent on Israel's own society in its seeking of embedding its own settler colonial thinking. So I'll just leave it at that because it opens up a very interesting dimension. So thanks, Marcello.
And maybe I will refer to Marcello's comment about the frontiers, which I find very important because of several reasons. First of all, I think if you want to understand settler colonial projects, and I totally agree with you, in relation to territory, we know how central the frontier is. And if you look at Israel-Palestine, we know how important it is, not just from 67, but even, you know, from the beginning of Zionism, and especially from 48 onwards. So I totally agree with you. However, I think that what James Rohn suggests is the differentiation between the ghetto and the frontier. And just, you know, in few words, for Rohn, the ghetto is a space where the state obviously operates in a violent way, but has some responsibility. So let's take East Jerusalem as an example of a ghetto. And Gaza, that used to be a ghetto, became a frontier, i.e. a territory where violence can take any form without any responsibility. So, you know, this is, you know, in a nutshell, James Rohn's understanding of the ghetto and the frontier. What I would totally agree with Marcello is that we should highlight or understand that not the frontier, but the frontierization. The process to reach a given territory becomes a subject or a space of endless violence without any responsibility. And I think this is also something that has, you know, a legal dimension that I don't think we can discuss here. And finally, I think, you know, I agree with what Marcello said, and I think Michelle also hinted on it. I think, you know, we as researchers, we have maybe a privilege to look at situations and to see the potential. And, you know, we cannot predict the future, but I think we can analyze the potential, or we can understand what the potential is. And I totally agree that, you know, I think Gaza, and that's how we started this project, Gaza becomes less and less central to the discussion, to the political discussion. Look at, you know, the politics currently in Israel-Palestine. Gaza is a non-issue. Whenever Israel wants, they bomb, they go, they leave. And I think, you know, maybe one of our roles is to bring it to the forefront.
Thank you so much. Thanks to all of you. Plenty of food for thought. I'd like to open the floor to questions now. Let's use the Zoom function of raising hands. That is, if you go to the participants, I think it will allow you to ask a question, raise your hand for questions. Failing that, just raise your hand physically, we hopefully catch you. Right, I see Hanley has raised her hand. Mastering the art of Zoom. Go ahead.
Thank you, Shahram. And thank you for the presentation. I'm understanding really from the final comments that that you see Gaza as more vulnerable, easier to dispose of in terms of a future. But what might be the other reasons why you're focusing on Gaza and not on the occupied Palestinian territories, therefore including the West Bank as well? Because if you talk about the Gazans perceiving themselves to not yet arrived death, I'm not sure that the West Bank, and especially certain areas such as Hebron in the West Bank, is that different.
Go ahead, Michelle.
Yes, so yes. I completely agree with you, Hanley, and I mean the thing that drew us to Gaza, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Haim, and Ziad as well, because he's with us, is that, you know, the majority of Gazans are all refugees, and they have been under siege for 13 years now. They've experienced 3 wars. The destruction is just unspeakable, and the increasing rate of suicides, which concerns me a lot personally, extremely, because it's amongst the youngest. is just too high not to focus on. And the reason why we use the concept of slow violence is precisely to put visibility on what seems to be invisible. Because, you know, in our world today, where everything is relying so much on social media, and especially with the corona crisis, things start to also just fall off our shoulders, right? We see deaths every day. We kind of become ourselves spectators and immune to actually what is it that people in Gaza are experiencing. I'm not saying that people in the West Bank are not similarly experiencing these things, but the extent of it in Gaza is just too much not to, you know, shed light on. Of course, if we're given funding, I'm sure that Haim and I and Ziad and potentially Manal will also move on to looking at the other parts of the occupied Palestinian territories. But it is a space that calls for help. And it brings us to, you know, a discussion on international aid and the implicit complicity of international donors as well. So I think it's a case of emergency that is already too late. So this is why the focus on Gaza.
And maybe I could add just a little thing. You know, I agree with you. I think, you know, what we can see that Hebron, for example, is another ghetto which is transformed into a frontier. So obviously, you know, we cannot measure who suffers more. And I think this is not the point. The point is really to understand the political, the spatial process. And just to add about, you know, when I came into the field of urban health, I was a bit surprised to see that there is a kind of uncritical understanding of health or health disparities. It is always understood as a fact, as a biomedical fact. And in my view, and that was the platform through which the Gaza project was developed, I think we should also look at the political determinants of health. What dictates the health of people? And it's not just, you know, their DNA or their environment conditions, but as we can see in the Gaza project, it has to do with ideology, it has to do with historical processes, etc., etc.
Thank you. Michelle has a question for you, Haim.
I would just like to add something else as well. I think it's important to also focus on the Israeli narrative about Gaza, because all Gazans are deemed to be terrorists. This is really important to mention because the language, the narrative of how Gazans are depicted as if, you know, they are inhuman and therefore they deserve inhumane actions upon them. So the body and the figure of the Gazan human is completely dehumanized from the Israeli settler colonial, you know, frame of and radar. And this is, again, something that is repeated intentionally. And as Marcello mentioned, it's indoctrinated not only from the IDF soldiers' point of view, but if you look at Marcello's work is important here. If you look at how education, you know, talks about the Palestinian figure in general, but specifically about Gazans, this is something that Israeli society is privy to from a very young age, and it goes from generation to generation. So it tells us something about the inherent hatred. There are very strong emotions here. And those of us who are privy to psychological studies, we know what these kind of emotions trigger in humans, right? So we have seen people, you know, on their sun loungers actually joking about, you know, what is happening in Gaza. So they become immune. And I think this is something very serious about the human condition, both in Israeli society, but also what it is, the effect of it in Gazan society.
Thanks, Michelle. I still have hands going up now. So Dara, do you have the order? Let's unmute the top.
Sorry, I was muted as well. We've got Shubha.
Yeah, hello, thank you so much for your presentation. I'm an assistant professor at Delhi University, India. I have two questions. The first question is that in 2016, December, I went to West Bank and our group stayed there for 15-20 days. But there were many restrictions and the surveillance was very strong in the sense that there were was from UK who wanted to do a photo exhibition back in London. But when we were checking out, the Israeli authority took everything away. Like they took the SIM card, the photos, the memory card of the camera, so that the photographer has no evidence. So that is the first question, that during your research, when you were doing understanding the sample and then questioning, what was the kind of surveillance and challenges that you were facing on the ground? That is one. The second is, this is something which I always, it troubles me, is because in Palestine, Israel, the economy is the Israeli currency.
Mm.
So how can any kind of independence be followed, say, in the next 20, 50 years, when even like we, for example, from India, if you go to Palestine and you by mistake get the Israeli stamp on your passport, you will not be allowed to visit any of the Gulf countries, which now might change. But the point is that when the currency itself is shekel, and no matter how much of BDS we try to follow, how can we stop this socio-economic victimization, which is a very pertinent fact of this settler colonialism, which has not been seen in other projects so far to this intensity? Thank you.
Go ahead. Hi, Michelle.
Okay, maybe I'll pick, the question about conducting field work and surveillance and difficulties. So I think it will be a very easy solution, and I hope that Ziad is still with us, so maybe he could say a few things about it. But what is very clear is that without Ziad, we wouldn't be able to conduct any research or field work in Gaza. And it has to do, first of all, with the ability of Ziad to reach the street, something that I cannot do, and Michelle has great difficulties to do. But also, I think it raises some ethical considerations that we need, to put on the table and discuss. Because Ziad, who will speak, I hope, very soon, I'm sure that, he faced some difficulties and tensions, some people he knows, some people he knows personally. What's the meaning of interviewing him? Luckily, we didn't, face any direct surveillance or limitation from the Israeli side. But I would prefer to give the other floor to say something about it.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hi. Yes. Thanks for all of you. And I really agree with the last point that you made, Professor Yaqub, about the difficulties. Difficulties not just inside Gaza, even as a Gazan, to access Gaza and to approach Gaza is a big issue. I think that when everybody speaks, why even Gaza is very distinctive. Why Gaza? Why not other places, for example? And I heard a lot of debates in the beginning about this point. I think that many actors in the region and worldwidely, are completely marginalized Gaza and just consider it as a backyard for everything they want. Everything they want to throw, they can throw it in Gaza. And they speak about Gaza when they need it, and they marginalize it completely and exclude it when also they need that to do so. And that's when, again, I just want to use some quotations that in my way to Gaza, when I was traveling from Cairo to Gaza, I was stuck there for, I remember, for 3-4 days prior to my approach Gaza. And part of them, I was 2 days almost in the desert, sleeping there. And then the borders and Suez Canal. And when even I spoke with some travelers about, my purpose of this journey, they told me it is, if we were in your shoes, we are not, take this a risky journey. We will do it by Skype, by phone, but whatsoever, because possibly you will be in Gaza. The war can, start at any moment, at any second. And the possibility of losing your life is highly likely to happen. And in addition to that also, you can be stuck for ages, 3 to 4 months in Gaza and more than this. And that's something very important on the ground. I interviewed one nurse from middle of Gaza and inside the hospital, and the woman told me something really, really very important, and is very relevant and has a lot of relation to our current discussion. She told me that while you are meeting me right now, while you are speaking to me right now, trust me, she said word by word, you don't have sort of any guarantee that all of us, we will leave this hospital alive. Because, you know, everything can happen without any sort of, even sometimes without warning signs. And that's, you know, the policy of fear, the policy, you know, the culture of fear is dominated in Gaza, even among the youth, the elder people, especially after 2014 war. That's from my perspective. The fear is really exist. And sorry if I really speak about different things, but about also accessing the people, the difficulties, the ethics of the interviews, all these kind of issues is really not something very simple, because also working in a very security complex area. You know, if you are not belong to that area, if you don't know the people, if that trust, the concept of trust does not exist between you and the people you are going to interview, is a really big issue. Even though in somehow I face some difficulties, and without, you know, taking into our consideration that the Mossad, for example, the Israeli intelligence service, were working in Gaza under the umbrella of NGOs, a human organization, very recently, 2 or 3 years ago. So this is really also created sort of a very sensitive environment for us as researchers to conduct interviews with the people. Even, for example, some people are asking sort of a permission from the Ministry of Internal Affairs even to speak to them. If, for example, I'm from Khan Yunis originally, if I will, for example, I travel to Jabalia, to north of Gaza, Rafah, Khan Yunis, middle of Gaza. So some people, if they really don't need personnel, if I don't come through their network, they will, you know, raise a different questions and why and how, and a lot of questions, because this is really important. And the most important thing about, you know, the slow violence in Gaza, that's really this concept. I think that, you know, the slow violence also, you know, and it is we can say prolonged, you know, not just a long siege and a long slow violence policy lead to people in Gaza to have sort of have nonsense about anything, nonsense. Regardless what is going on, some people, they have sort of frozen feeling about everything. What is going on? So they drag the people to that conclusion. You know, they don't care what is going on next tomorrow, because for them tomorrow and today and evening and morning almost the same. Drones are dominated. The possibility of war and the possibility of escalation exists on the table 24/7. Yeah, and you know, the hope of solution, the hope of the breakthrough. That's what I have. For example, through the doctors, I interviewed almost 5 to 6 medical doctors, and all of them are the head of the hospitals in Gaza, including them the Shifa itself. I found sort of even frustrations among the doctors. For example, when one doctor told me that even our doctors, for example, Dr. Kamal Khatib from Shuhada Al-Aqsa Hospital in middle of Gaza, he told me our doctors are really suffering a lot to pay. Even, you know, they don't have sufficient money to pay their transport to come to the hospital, and therefore they are walking a long distance. And other doctors, even in European Gaza Hospital in Khan Yunis, the head of the hospital, Al-Aggad, told me that imagine how the doctors will work with a full energy, with full capacity, if he even cannot feed his children. Yeah. And even the head of the Shifa raised this issue with me about the sellers, you know, about the income of the doctors in Gaza. So you talk about, if we consider
it's a complete sense of hopelessness, Ziad, that you have captured in your research. That is that comes through quite strongly. I see lots of hands up. I think Riyadh had his hand up.
Yes.
Shall we go to Riyadh?
Yes. No. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, I think my question is similar to the one that has been handled just now.
Yeah.
Which is access to research and access to information. I recently finished the book by Rashid Khalidi on the 100 Years War on Palestine. I really recommend that book, and in which he talks about some specific aspects of access to information and access to research. So I just want to ask the following: is it easier to do research in the West Bank than in Gaza? Number one. And number two, if there is restricted access to the people there, and the level of like surveillance that's on researchers there, is the reality worse than what we have access to?
Thank you, Riyad. Michelle or Haim, would you like to respond to that quickly?
Well, I can tell you that the last time I was allowed into Gaza was 2016. And every time I personally have been through Ben Gurion Airport, I have been in the waiting room from 3 to 8 hours. So, and this is both entering and leaving. So your computer is opened and checked. Questions are repeatedly made at you. It's a kind of form of torture because you're deemed to be dumb, basically, and they have a set of 10 questions. And usually the IDF soldiers who are questioning you are 18 years old. So, and their body language also tells a lot. So they're sitting behind a desk, they've got their feet up on the table, and they kind of point, you know, their gun sometimes at you and say, you know, so what are you doing here and why are you here and why are you working only with Palestinians? And my argument has been that, you know, since Israel is a democracy, I have to work with the rest, right? Because it's almost like untouchable. So I've developed a kind of sarcasm because I know I'm on the list and I'm being watched. I've had, every time I've been to Gaza, I used to be at the University of Birmingham before, and I've had my phone stabbed both at home and at university. So you know, we actually developed a group of researchers in the UK when I was still there, who were constantly experiencing these forms of torture. And some of us have been strip searched, being told that we're carriers of drugs from Gaza to Europe, all sorts of things. Not to mention that, you know, these machines that we now see all over the place, in all airports, these were tested on those entering Gaza. So they actually, you know, scan your body, which you're not asked, you know, can we do this? You just automatically have to go through it. Not to mention the radiology effect of this. So you know, you become part and parcel of this narrative that you are entering a terrorist territory, and therefore either you choose to become complicit in this terrorism, and that's how they depict you as a researcher. So these are things you have to learn to live with. I was pregnant once when I was entering Gaza. I was pregnant with my first child, 3 months pregnant. And the kind of abuse, I was left without water for 8 hours. I told the police at the Eretz checkpoint that I needed water, and they didn't give me water. So this is systematic, right? So it's not just the subjects that are, you know, being targeted in Gaza. It's also anyone who tries to bring some evidence. And this is something that relates to the previous question by Shubda. The idea of evidence is so important, and that's why I want to mention that I work with Haim, because Haim is somebody I've known since 2003, and he's one of the few Israelis who told me, Michelle, I cannot live in Israel. And then I knew that I was working with somebody who was true to himself and who couldn't be part of this settler colonial narrative, right? And people like Marcello, for example, these are the people I work with. But it's important to also zoom in. Our research needs to zoom in on those Israeli subjects who are part and parcel of this narrative, who are cognizant of what they're doing, and they still remain there. So I think one of the hopes we have is to actually target Israeli society and to make Israelis aware that they are pawns in this Israeli narrative that is seeking to destruct not only Palestinians, but eventually it will destruct Israeli society as well. And that's why we need more than ever this evidence.
On that point, can I use my chair prerogative and jump in and ask you perhaps, Haim and Michelle, to reflect on the rationale behind the actions of the Israeli state? Because I don't think I've picked up on what the rationale is. What is the end game? What is the objective of this slow violence in Gaza or Palestinian occupied territories?
I think you know,
Marcello
maybe
wants to come in as
yeah,
well.
let Marcello. Yeah.
Thanks, guys. I think the answer is quite simple and very, very sad, deeply sad. It's the elimination of indigenous people of Palestine, given in terms of their total displacement or a sort of combination of displacement and genocide. This is what we are witnessing. This is where it's going. And this is why we need so badly the international community to interfere with all its strength.
Yeah.
Okay. Just quickly, Michelle, because there are more questions. Go ahead.
Just to supplement this, the rationale is a greater Israel. This has always been the Zionist dream, you know, and that's the plan from the start. I mean, this is before 1948.
Okay. All right. There is, I see Sama has raised her hand. Go ahead, Sama.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Excellent presentations. Thank you so much for this, for organizing it, and for your research, Chaim and Michelle, and Marcello for your comments as well. Some of the stuff I wanted to say has already been mentioned, so please forgive me if I'm stating the obvious. I was really interested in, you know, Marcello's comment about Gaza and the use of the frontier for settler colonialism when you're talking about Gaza. And we're often thinking of the West Bank when we're thinking settler colonialism. So your research does a real service of highlighting that it's settler colonialism comes in both sides, comes, you know, they're both part of the settler colonial project. But I think from the Palestinian point of view, there's a little bit of nuances between West Bank and what they view as their enemy. They're fighting every day for land, building permits, freedom of movement, rights to access their livelihoods and so on. Whereas in Gaza, they're fighting for survival. They're fighting literally to just stay alive. And that makes it very different in the way they view the enemy. Whereas in the West Bank, they see Israeli soldiers. In Gaza, there's a demonization that occurs for not actually having any kind of daily interaction with these soldiers. They just see them in the sky as behind machines, almost in a science fiction kind of reality that we can't even imagine unless we've been there. And I understand some of you have been there, and of course the Palestinian researchers live there. But when you're talking about, and I'm going to come to this point very quickly now, Marcello, you were talking about the question of addressing the, what's the word you used? The exploitation, I think is the word Marcello used, the exploitation that comes with settler colonialism. And when we're addressing that, it's very clear that for the West Bank, they're talking about land. The exploitation comes for land, resources, Dead Sea products, etc. In Gaza, it's really focused on resistance, on shutting down the resistance of the Palestinian people. And the resources at question here are in the sea for the most part. It's the gas fields. And so when Shahram asked the question of what's the end goal, it is genocide, it is ethnic cleansing. But I think to make it more practical and tangible for the minds of the everyday person to understand, this is about resources. This is about taking the water, taking the gas, taking the farming land and getting rid of the people. But they're not just getting rid of the people because they hate them. They're getting rid of them because they're in the way of these resources that they want to capture for themselves. So it is about the money as well in a big way. It's not just about testing the weapons on the Gazans or testing the technology. It really is literally about taking over the gas and you know, the money resources that are in Gaza, and at the same time killing the resistance. Gaza is the frontier in the sense of resistance in the minds of the Palestinians. Thank you so much. I hope I didn't take up too much of your time.
Thank you, Sama. That's fantastic. We take it as a comment. We'll go to the last question. I think we have just enough time for the last question. And then Michelle, Chaim, and Marcelo, perhaps you can have a final reflection on the question and the conversation. So I think Mohammed is the last person.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for a great presentation. It's good to see you again. To briefly touch on the Israeli logic for the blockade on Gaza, I think the best explanation was put forward by Victor Lieberman when he was Minister of Defense. He said, quote unquote, that we are not Hamas, we are not cannibals, so we will allow them, Gazans, to keep their heads above the water, but nothing beyond that. So it's to maintain Gaza barely survivable, yet unlivable. And the logic in that interview with Lieberman is that he says this would eventually lead Hamas to demilitarize in return to make Gaza Singapore and the Mediterranean. But the question here is, would Hamas demilitarize? Israelis acknowledge very well that Hamas's primitive homemade collection of weaponry is particularly set for defense and deterrence. It's the only thing that prevents Gaza from becoming a clone of the West Bank, where Israeli jeeps can go in and out and settlers can just cross the border, attack the population. So that's out of the question. But the other question, would Israel ever forcefully take Hamas's weapons away? And Netanyahu answered that very clearly in 2018 in an interview with Israel Hayom, saying that we will not go into Gaza because if we do and we take Hamas out, we will have to give Gaza back to Abu Mazen. And I don't want to give it to Mahmoud Abbas. And then he said the connection between Gaza and the West Bank has been permanently severed. We should keep it that way. So
okay.
That's basically, yeah.
Let's go to final comments by our speakers. Thank you, Mohammed. Michelle,
well,
I don't have a final comment. I mean, I think, you know, it was a very, I mean, first of all, I would like to thank you all for your comments and questions, because this is still a work in progress for Michelle, myself, Ziad, and a few other colleagues. So I would like to thank you. And yeah, and, you know, I think Mohammed's last comment really put us in the, I think, in the right context.
My last comment is just to the international community that if we look at the case of South Africa, I think the only remaining hope is actually sanctions, because from the comment we had on the Israeli shekel, it's clear that all the plans on the table are empty rhetoric. There's nothing in it for Palestinians. So I think if we really believe in the survival of Palestinians as a nation, the only way is sanctions to the Israeli state.
Okay, with those comments, we do need to wrap up. Thank you so much, our speakers, Chaim, Michelle, and Marcello, for joining us today, sharing your research, your reflections on this really heart-wrenching topic. Thanks to all participants for your questions and comments. You can, of course, join us in the future. We do have other events planned on 3rd of September. Let me do some marketing here. 3rd of September, we have our next session looking at proxy wars in the Middle East by Professor Andrew Mumford, who's based at Nottingham University. So I hope you can join us. For now, please join me in thanking our speakers virtually.
Thank you.
This is the best we can do. If you were in Australia, we would be offering you some tea and biscuits, but that has to wait.
I'll put it in my to-do list.
That's great. Look forward to it. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you all. Thank you.